Thank you everyone for joining us for Preserving America's Historic Main Streets. This is the second webinar for or of the ACHP's 2026 Preserve the Past, Build for the Future webinar series. We're recording the session and it will be made available later on our YouTube channel. If you're interested in either sending it to anyone you know might be interested or rewatching it yourself. Also, if you need closed captioning, please click on the Show Captions button within the Zoom screen on your own computer. Hi, I'm Ashley Fry. I'm the director of the Office of External Engagement at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And joining me today is Lynn Richmond. She's the ACHP's Communications Officer. Historic main streets across the nation are centers of commerce, culture, and daily life that reflect America's evolving story. And in this webinar, we will explore preservation efforts impacting America's historic districts and hear from those involved in protecting these areas for the enjoyment of future generations. Our speakers today will share their preservation challenges and successes, as well as how engagement in preservation has transformed their communities. We have assembled an excellent panel, and we hope this webinar will educate you about the interesting aspects of historic preservation in relation to our main streets. Just a quick word about the ACHP. We're an independent federal agency that promotes the preservation of America's historic places, and we advise the President and Congress on national historic preservation policy. The ACHP is the only federal agency whose sole mission is historic preservation. And a large part of our work is overseeing the Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act process, which requires federal agencies and those receiving federal funding or federal licensure to consider historic preservation when carrying out an undertaking. And you can find more out about us at our website. We'll put the link in the chat, but our website's www.achp.gov. We're excited about today's guests, so I'll do a very quick introduction. Lindsey Wallace is a senior planner and services director for the 106 Group. Ellie Staley is the executive director of the Downtown Bozeman Partnership in Bozeman, Montana. And Julie Courtney is the historic preservation officer in the planning and building department of the city of St. Augustine, Florida. We're really excited to have all of you, and thank you for joining us today. But before we begin, if you have any questions or comments for the speakers, please put them in the chat box. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's the chat icon. If you could put your questions there and not in another area that says Q&A, that'll be helpful for us to be able to quickly get to them in the order that they're submitted. So once the speakers have given their presentations, we'll call on those who have put questions in that chat area. So we'll begin with Lindsey Wallace. Lindsey, we're really glad to have you join us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me, and hello everybody. Thanks for joining. This is a subject very near and dear to my heart, of course, so excited to talk to you all about it. I'm just getting my slides set up. My internet is a little slow, so please be patient. There we go. All right, so like Ashley noted, I'm Lindsey Wallace. I'm the senior planner a senior planner and services director at the 106 Group. We're based in the Twin Cities. My perspective today, though, is really kind of giving an overview for national work in Main Streets. I used to work at the National Main Street Center, which is also known as the Main Street America. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But my background is in historic preservation planning. So my whole almost 20-year career has been in preservation. I've been lucky enough to be working in that and kind of the various aspects. So love to talk to you all about that. So just a quick thing, just because this is where I am now, and I'm not sure that everybody is as familiar with this as the national organizations I mentioned, but I am the services director at 106 Group, and we are a cultural resources consultant based in the Twin Cities, but we work across the country. We're a medium-sized firm. We have about 30 staff, 30 full-time staff. And we do a variety of things. And one of the reasons I love working here is because of the various backgrounds and kinds of projects we get to work on. But our three main sectors are cultural resource management. So that is your pretty standard regulatory compliance, kind of the Section 106 work in architectural history and archaeology, as well as National Register nominations, historic preservation surveys, all of those kinds of things. It ties very closely to our cultural heritage planning sector, which we do, plenty of preservation plans. We do cultural heritage tourism plans as well. And we also contribute to master plans, kind of threading through the critical nature of historic preservation and cultural heritage in a master planning process. And then our other sector is in interpretation and exhibit design. So telling the stories, right? Telling the stories at the places where things happened. We work in a lot of parks, which is really cool to kind of thread through preservation and conservation in our work. But then we do also exhibits and other kinds of waysides, interpretation, planning, and that kind of stuff in a variety of places. So look us up. We're a fun cultural heritage consulting firm, and we get to do a lot of fun work. So it's a good place to be. Similarly, though, one of the reasons I'm here today is because I spent 8 years with Main Street America, and before that with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, both wonderful places, both nonprofits, and actually with Main Street America. So it's the national nonprofit organization that oversees Main Street work, leads Main Street work. It was founded in 1980, though, as a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So Main Street work has always been centered in historic preservation as a primary methodology. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Main Street America is now a subsidiary nonprofit, so kind of running things on their own. And I joined shortly after that became the subsidiary nonprofit. But essentially, Main Street America as an organization leads a collaborative movement. So partners and grassroots leaders are central to the work. But the organization advances shared prosperity, creates resilient economies, and improves quality of life through that place-based economic development and community preservation. So a lot of things going on, but the main goal is that kind of that shared prosperity through place-based preservation and economic development, local investment. What is Main Street work? So kind of hinted at that, right? But really, Main Street work is grassroots. It is sophisticated and organized as well, but it kind of starts from community, right? So the community is central. Place-based, meaning that where you are, where you're leveraging your unique assets, you're really focused on local investment, improving quality of life for people who live there. But it's also a movement focused on sustainable, equitable economic development, community building, meaning that whatever we're investing in is meant to support people, support quality of life for the long term, right? So it's very much in support of that kind of 8 to 80 cities concept, which I'm sure you've heard some about. That's more about physical design, which we'll talk about in a second, but the concept around aging in place, around having a community that fits everybody, that meets everybody's needs. But of course, what we noted is that it centers preservation as a key methodology, which is why we're here. Really looks at how preserving your physical environment can support these other goals of that shared economic development, of that community building. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The physical focus tends to be on commercial districts across the country. So this can be practiced in rural and urban communities. So Main Street work isn't just any one type of place, right? Or it doesn't have to happen in any one type of place. You can practice Main Street work really anywhere, as long as you have a collection of buildings and folks who want to focus on the work we're describing here. So commercial districts in big cities, one major wonderful program of Main Street work is in Boston, for instance. They were a really early adopter of the concept, and they perform Main Street work in those distinct commercial districts around the country. And then there are many wonderful rural communities across the country too that do this great work as well, really lead the way. So I wanted to show just kind of the depth and breadth, right? So these maps are from Main Street America. It just goes to show that while there is a national nonprofit that provides a lot of resources and support and learning and kind of broader community opportunities to gather, like conferences, the actual work is done by everybody from national, state, local, right? So you have up there on the upper left, those are what are called coordinating programs. So those are state and citywide programs that lead the work of Main Street in those states. Now, there are other statewide entities that do this too. These are just the maps from Main Street America and it's the kind of the organized network. But there are a lot of folks who do this work that aren't in the organized network that should be celebrated too. Then you see here on the lower right that those are the formal Main Street communities that are a part of that Main Street network. And again, there's other folks who do that who aren't part of the membership, but do similar work that is similarly impactful in their communities. But you can see that this Main Street ethos, this approach really is national, right? It's kind of everywhere. And that only makes it stronger because we can learn from each other and learn how to apply best practices in different places. This is just something to throw out there. So this is a really cool thing that Main Street America does every year, where they gather what are called reinvestment statistics. So these are from 2024. This is really just to help show the impact of Main Street work, the impact of preservation work, the impact of those various fields that come together within Main Street work. It just goes to show what you can do when you kind of put your heads together that way, right? So when we talk about the dollars reinvested, those are local reinvestment. So that is local prosperity, local wealth building based on Main Street work, which includes not only historic preservation, but that, the economic development work that we want to talk about here. So one thing that Main Street America often talks about, does a lot of training around, is what's called the 4-point approach, right? So the 4 major themes or areas that Main Street work encompasses. So you have design, which preservation kind of threads through all 4 of these, but when we think about like very specific preservation work, like design guidelines, infill direction, that kind of thing, that falls under design. So facade improvement programs, those kinds of things, that would all fall under design. The other thing that in more recent years has been central to this point is the idea of accessible design. So when I mentioned that 8 to 80 cities concept, that kind of approach where, yes, we want to maintain our cultural heritage. We want to have these buildings be useful for the people in town. We want them to sustain growth and all of that. We also want everybody in the community to be able to access them, to be able to enjoy them from, cradle to grave kind of thing. So that accessibility is a critical piece too. Economic vitality, obviously, this is a central piece of Main Street work. This is really about finding your unique assets, unique people, unique opportunities, local entrepreneurs, kind of supporting a varied economy in the local community based on what the strengths are, opportunities, and people's interests. So there's a lot of very focused strategic work that goes into defining what that economic development opportunities are. A lot of communities do this, just sort of outside of the Main Street network, but it's that same kind of concept. And the other 2 pieces here, so organization is really about codifying the program. So building out an organizational framework, whether it's a nonprofit or whether it's housed in a local agency, local government agency, just having some framework around that so you can professionalize the work and build out that breadth and depth to have the greater impact locally. And then with promotion, that's really, again, about that storytelling. Sometimes some communities are really, really good at holding events that bring people together. Some folks are really good at building like self-guided tours and things like that, that really promote what's special about the community and why you'd either want to visit, stay, or play. Who does Main Street work? So this is one of my favorite things about Main Street work generally, is that even though it's centered on historic preservation, and that's what brings a lot of us together, and that's why a lot of us are here today, it by nature requires the intentional activity of a lot of different kinds of people. So that if you're coming to it from preservation, like I am, say, I need to learn how to talk about preservation to a variety of people to make sure that where I'm coming from meets up with where they're coming from so we can reach a mutually beneficial goal, decision, that kind of thing. So planners, of course, community builders and organizers are central, economic development professionals in kind of the more traditional setting. Nonprofit leaders, government agencies are huge. Small business owners are critical. They're often the building owners. So even if they're not preservationists themselves or are actually super interested in history, there are many ways to talk to them about how important their buildings are to the community story, to that community quality of life. And then, of course, you have your designers, architects, placemakers, place keepers, place builders, the folks that like to activate sort of vacant spaces, for instance, like a pocket park or other things like that, where you may have a part of town that's a little less vital, a little less active. Your placemakers often enter the picture to see how to activate that space, see how to integrate that into the greater community. Students, we're always talking about how important it is to engage youth in any of these endeavors. Because we want to make sure these outcomes are sustainable over time, and youth and students need to have a say in that. And then you, wherever you're coming from, whatever your job is, you probably play some kind of role in making Main Street work in your community beneficial to everybody. So it's a really exciting part of this. Sometimes when you work in other fields in preservation, you don't get that same crossover. It's a very exciting part of Main Street work to keep your brain active, to keep engaging folks on things that matter to you, but things that matter to community as well. So preservation in Main Street, how I wanted to highlight a couple things that are specifically preservation about Main Street. So we talked a little bit about some of these things, but I know one thing that came up a lot was around that physical structure, that building. So looking at how preservation can save money for building owners, whether it's through retrofits for energy, maintenance, just to keep things up, and save on different kinds of costs. That's always one that building owners take to heart. Cultural heritage is a central quality of life. So much about what makes Main Streets important and what creates this opportunity for that sustainable economic impact is cultural heritage. So the buildings that you have, the physical places, are the manifestations, are the actual visual reminders of that cultural heritage, both in the past and that define the community now, right? Which is critical. Leveraging unique assets, we talked a little bit about that. Adaptive use and vitality, so keeping things active, right? So an old building doesn't have to stay frozen in amber. With Main Street and good preservation practice generally, it's about that continued use. Surveys, documentation, storytelling, all of that kind of traditional preservation work and documentation helps support the telling of the stories, the promotion of a community's visual and preservation assets. And then, of course, that shared community benefit is a critical piece of Main Street, why Main Street works, why it's an important demonstration of preservation, is that the shared community goals and the kind of varied aspects that inform that. I am going to pass it on to the next person. This is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. This picture, I have to give a shout out to Douglas, Wyoming. Wyoming has one of the best Main Street programs in the country. Fantastic. And Douglas, Wyoming is a wonderful place. One of their primary stories, aside from beautiful historic downtown, is the jackalope. I'll leave you with that. You can check it out yourself, but it's a really cool place. Thanks for having me, and I'll pass it on to the next book.
Thanks so much, Lindsey. Now we're going to welcome Ellie Staley. Again, she's from the Downtown Bozeman Partnership. So, Ellie, turning it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsey. I think that was a really great segue into my presentation today. Generally speaking, the macro to the micro. So Bozeman, Montana is a small metropolitan area, and we think we're doing some fun things here. So thank you so much for having me. I'm Ellie Staley. I'm the Executive Director of the Downtown Bozeman Partnership. I always enjoy opportunities like this, especially when I get to talk about Bozeman and the intentional choices our community has made to protect its history while continuing to grow, as many of you know. A quick disclaimer, I am not a historic preservation expert. I'm more of an enthusiastic collaborator who knows when to call the experts. So I do want to thank former city historic preservationist Sarah Rosenberg and Crystal Allegria with the Extreme History Project here in Bozeman. Both great experts. Their work, along with so many others, have helped shape this presentation and have contributed so much to the historic character of our community and beyond. All right, next slide. All right, so what is interesting about Bozeman is the way downtown looks now and functions today is very much rooted in how it was originally built in the late 1800s. So early Main Street buildings, as you can see, were designed with tall storefront windows, detailed facades, and narrowed widths. The layout encouraged walkability and many small locally owned businesses, something that still defines downtown Bozeman today. Bozeman Creek also played an important role. It shaped early development and supported industry. While it's less visible now, in many parts not visible at all, it still runs just behind Main Street and continues to connect people to that landscape. After early fires, many buildings were rebuilt in brick, which is why so much of downtown still has that strong historic feel. Buildings like the Baxter Hotel, pictured here on the right bottom, buildings like the Baxter Hotel, along with others along Main, date back to that era. The street grid, as you can see here, is also key. Short blocks and a compact layout make downtown easy to walk, which is a huge part of its energy still today. And from the beginning, Main Street has been the civic heart of Bozeman. That hasn't changed. It's still where people gather, celebrate, and connect. And you'll see examples of that here shortly. As you all know, downtowns today are competing with a lot: suburban retail, online shopping, the convenience of endless surface parking lots. So people don't come downtown just to buy something. They come downtown for experience, authenticity, and sense of place. In Bozeman, this didn't happen by accident. It came from intentional decisions. In the 1980s, the community created the Downtown Urban Renewal District, which is actually the district I help manage today. It continues to be a critical funding tool for public improvements in our historic core, supporting things like facades, lighting, streetscapes, infrastructure, while keeping the historic character intact. In 1990, downtown was added to the National Register of Historic Places. That recognition encourages preservation instead of demolition. This was during a time when we were seeing a lot of buildings get torn down, and I think Bozeman made some really great decisions early on. The city also strengthened its approach through historic code and policy tools and continues this through today, including the Neighborhood Conservation Overlay District, or NCOD, which was established in 1991. This is a zoning overlay that covers thousands of properties and helps protect neighborhood scale and character, especially in areas surrounding the historic districts. Properties within the NCOD require a certificate of appropriateness, ensuring that changes align with existing context. Design guidelines have further ensured that new developments fits the scale and rhythm of Main Street. Together, these decisions made preservation not just about nostalgia, but a strategy for long-term economic vitality. This only works because of strong partnerships, and we take that very seriously in downtown. The Downtown Bozeman Partnership plays a key role in keeping downtown active, clean, and welcoming. Through the Business Improvement District, or BID, we focus on the day-to-day experience. This includes maintenance, trash, banners, and graffiti removal, all the things that make downtown feel clean, safe, and cared for. We also bring people downtown to events like the Summer Art Walks, Christmas Stroll, which also activate the historic spaces and keep them relevant. Just as important is coordination with the city, from establishing a vision for Bozeman Creek to planning decisions focused around public improvements. We work together to make sure growth aligns with the character people value. At the end of the day, preservation and walkability only work when public investment, private property owners, and community pride are aligned. What we see today is a downtown that is vibrant, active, and resilient. If you haven't been to Bozeman, you need to come and visit us. It's more than just a regional destination. We see strong national and international visitation, and with Yellowstone and many natural amenities nearby. Downtown also supports hundreds of local businesses, and it's a place where both residents and visitors genuinely want to spend time. That outcome reflects years of intentional choices and sustained investment. There are a few key lessons behind it. First, preserving early matters. Once historic character is lost, it's very difficult to rebuild. Second, walkability and preservation go hand in hand. The physical design supports the kind of experience people are looking for. Third, partnerships are critical. This only works when organizations, businesses, and the community are aligned. And finally, authenticity wins. People are drawn to places that feel real, not replicated. And I feel that's truly the case in downtown Bozeman. So that is everything for me. I assume we'll have some questions, and thanks so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Ellie. Yeah, we'll ask for questions after Julie is finished. But thanks so much for your presentation. Julie, you are up next. Julie Courtney from the city of St. Augustine.
So as you said, my name is Julie Courtney. I'm the Historic Preservation Officer for the City of St. Augustine. I work for the Planning and Building Department, and we have our own Historic Preservation Division. We have a small staff within our city government. Within the Historic Preservation Division, we have myself, a historic preservation planner, Candace Seymour, who's my great helper, and we kind of split a lot of work between us with the preservation issues that we deal with. And then we have an archaeology program with 3 full-time archaeologists. I too did work for the Main Street world at one point in my life. I have a master's in historic preservation, but I worked in Michigan for a coordinating program that was one of the only countywide coordinating programs for Main Street. We had like 40 traditional downtowns, and I was an assistant coordinator. So I'm very familiar with the Main Street program. St. Augustine is not within that program though, even though Florida does have a statewide coordinating program for Main Street. I did go through the certification process. That was a painful process. So I am a certified Main Street manager, but my love has always been historic architecture, and that fit well with my other degrees. I kind of listed them out here because I know there's some students listening, and I just want to encourage you that all of your education and experience will definitely come into play with your job in historic preservation, because there's such a multifaceted requirement of knowledge and experience. So I moved to St. Augustine about 10 years ago, almost 11 years ago now. For those who don't know where that is located, we're just south of Jacksonville, in Northeast Florida. And we have a great location in our downtown. We are kind of between the intercoastal and the Atlantic Ocean. We have a barrier island buffering us, which is Anastasia Island, which is part of the city. And the Dixie Highway kind of encouraged a lot of people to experience St. Augustine early in the 1900s. And that included my grandparents who lived in Michigan and the Thumb. They were farmers actually. And as they got older, they would winter in St. Augustine. So that was one of the first times I had heard of the city, and I hadn't really explored, you know, going there until we actually considered moving to Florida. But St. Augustine has such an interesting history, and it's something that you don't hear about a lot of times in school growing up. At least I didn't in the Midwest. And I know the people on the East Coast don't as well. I mean, this whole Spanish influence and the Spanish, settlement of our country is not really discussed in history. And St. Augustine has a lot of kind of superlatives, but we would say that we are the oldest continuously occupied settlement of European and African American heritage and in the United States. And it was 42 years before the English colonized Jamestown. And like I said, there's a lot of superlatives for St. Augustine as well. Not only are we the oldest city in the United States, but we have, the narrowest street and a lot of rankings that we've achieved over the years, including being the most walkable city, within the country and within the top 10, or the South's best small town. There's a lot of great maps, historic maps that are really interesting to look at, of the development of the city core. And when Miss Lynn reached out to me to talk about St. George Street, I just wanted to show you that, I mean, even in the Spanish colonial era, there was a developed downtown area, the city core, and St. George Street. I have identified with the orange arrow, but that was just one of the many streets of the Spanish settlement. And this was also documenting the land use for the city, showing St. George Street and how the city kind of developed from the waterfront, the bayfront, westward. And a great aerial bird's eye view of the city, later in the late 1800s. And then tourism has always been a big part of St. Augustine. So we have a lot of tourist maps. This is from the 1980s. It kind of captures a lot of the city, but when you zoom in to St. George Street, it kind of is what some people think of as St. Augustine's Main Street. But I just wanted to show you that even though it is a very important part of the city, all of our downtown core is very vibrant and very much visited by our visitors. And St. George Street, especially north of our plaza, the central plaza that the Spanish created, is probably the most well-known tourist destination. But again, the restaurants, hotels, businesses all extend throughout our downtown core. And as a city, we've struggled with a lot of, things, events that probably are similar to some of your towns, but that made a great impact on our city. We're very much impacted by water, fires. Historically, we've had many significant fires that burnt the city down to the ground almost. Some were set on purpose. One of those fires was set by the British when they invaded. And we also had the challenge of we have the challenge currently and historically of having visitors. And when you think about the Native Americans being here first, I'm sure they weren't maybe thinking that the Spanish were the friendliest of visitors. And there's a lot of history with our Native American culture. The city basically started as an outpost, a military outpost, so there's a lot of remnants of that. Some of them are only archaeological remnants, but we also have visible, remnants of the past with our agricultural roots. There's a lot of orange groves that surrounded the city outside of the city walls. But the thing that people might think of the most with St. Augustine is the Castillo. And there was actually two Spanish forts that were built by the Spanish. The primary one was eventually rebuilt with coquina, which is a unique shell stone. Basically, it's compressed tiny little coquina shells, that was very impervious to cannons and very resilient. But that is kind of the thing some people think of when they think of St. Augustine. And the that is something that draws visitors today. It's still a vibrant, historic resource in our city. And, it's very much beloved by the locals and visitors alike, including our visits. We had two great visits by the Spanish royalty, one in 2001 and one in 2015, the King and Queens of Spain at those different years visited and stopped at the Castillo. The last visit at 2015 was for the city's 450th celebration of the Spanish settlement. Another remnant of our military past and kind of the military outpost that we are and were was the city gates. And these are another, very famous landmark. There's many wonderful photos of it. And you can kind of take a peek at St. George Street when you look through those city gate posts. People came to St. Augustine in the late, starting in the 1800s because of its idyllic location by the water. And a lot of people came for the winter. And there's a lot of great images, showing all the different sites. This was, from around 1909, showing some of the key sites of St. Augustine. But the thing that brought people the most were the hotels that Henry Flagler built. And he was very much what kind of radicalized and revolutionized St. Augustine into a major tourist destination that it became. People would come for the whole winter and stay in this very elaborate hotels. There were 3 of them that he ran, all in close proximity to each other. The most famous and the most opulent was the Ponce de Leon Hotel that was completed in 1887. He also, and there's just some really great images of those. I just wanted to kind of give you a peek of those. And they're still used today as kind of landmark buildings, but each of them have a different use now. The Ponce Hotel is now the main academic building, or the institutional building for Flagler College, which was founded in 1968. This is the Alcazar Hotel, and it was built again, sorry, in the late 1800s. 1889 was when it was completed. And both of those hotels were made with poured coquina concrete, which is a very kind of unique material that's pretty much unique to St. Augustine in our country. The Alcazar Hotel had the largest indoor pool in the country, or in the world as it was advertised, and elaborate gardens. And you can see that there's been adaptive use of this building. There's a Leitner Museum in part of the hotel building. And then City Hall is actually where I work, is actually in the other portion, the main portion of the building. There was another hotel across the street from us, and that was the Casa Monica Hotel. And that went through many changes. You can kind of see how it deteriorated over time, but luckily, I'll go back to that really quick. I mean, in the 60s, it was kind of looking worse for wear, but then the county actually occupied the building. And at a different point in its history later, it became a hotel once again. So it's now kind of a fancy Marriott hotel. There were hotels before that, and those, kind of did focus around St. George Street. And it is something interesting to think about all the visitors coming from different economic levels. The guests of Henry Flagler were probably much wealthier, but then there were hotels that were probably at different price points, and there were boarding houses along the street and other streets as well. We do have some really great historic photos of St. George Street, and they're really fun to look at. I mean, when I complain about the cell companies wanting to put in a large antenna, I always have to remind myself. I mean, we've been trying to fight those off, but it is interesting how those large telephone poles were so prominent, even very early on in the city's history. There's some more great old photos. And you can kind of see the juxtaposition of St. George Street from, probably the early 1900s. And then, by the 1950s, it was kind of definitely showing a lot of wear and tear. It was kind of in decline, actually. And was very much, a mixed use street with lots of different businesses. And by the time before the 1950s, they actually did try to set aside St. George Street as almost like a colonial Williamsburg. They were going to try to do a Spanish colonial type village. And the key street of that would be St. George Street. That actually did receive some funding by the Carnegie Institute. But when World War II came along, the focus was on other things. By the 1950s, like I said, there was kind of a great decline. And then they started looking to the 400th anniversary of St. Augustine. And so in the 1960s, late 1959-ish, a preservation board was founded. There's a lot of history behind all of that, and I can't go into very much detail because of the time. I can provide you a resource if you want to learn more. But there was actually reconstructions starting along St. George Street primarily, and on other streets as well, close by. But those were based on archaeological evidence. And there were a few existing buildings, that were in between these kind of modified, mid-century buildings and Victorian buildings. There was some actually, Spanish colonial buildings like this one, the Pena Peck House, that started out, as a one-story Spanish colonial building. That was actually the treasurer's house for the King of Spain, for the St. Augustine location. So those buildings were actually studied, there was archaeological studies done. There was like comparison of the existing buildings to see what needed to be done when they rehabilitated it properly. And there were kind of very concerted efforts to make as many buildings as they could look to be back into the Spanish colonial period or the British colonial, which also included the second floors that had been added to those early Spanish colonial buildings and those second floor balconies that you see in our city. which is something like this. So here's a comparison showing kind of in some ways how little did change along St. George Street from 1905 to 2013. I mean, it's very interesting because even though there was a lot of wealth coming into the city, St. Augustine was really a sleepy town. It was pretty modest. There wasn't a lot of wealth that lived there year round. So in some ways that did save our city from major change and kind of complete devastation with our historic resources. The city actually was involved with owning some of those historic buildings that I've talked about, the reconstructed buildings and historic buildings, or they were in charge of overseeing them. They also took it upon themselves through a heritage tourism department that is now no longer existing within the city to create basically a tour guide handbook. And they were kind of like the authority of St. Augustine's history. They also ran almost like a living museum, the Colonial Spanish Quarter Museum, and that too was just not financially sustainable. So they basically sold that off to a private entity, the operation. It's being managed by the University of Florida St. Augustine Historic Association. And today, St. George Street is, kind of a mixed bag. It's kind of interesting with the, the effort to make it the colonial Spanish village that they dreamt of in the 1930s and again in the 1960s did not completely take off. So we do have a mixture of architecture within that street corridor, especially. But there's a lot of historic charm and people very much like highlight that with, their Instagram posts or Facebook posts. A lot of visitors, from Europe actually come, from Spain, they come to visit. And a lot of people note that it does look and feel like a European city. A lot of that is because of how, we were founded by the Spanish and how architecture was built originally close to the street and in a certain style and certain ways. We, without the Main Street program, have a lot of visitors to our city. We have a Nights of Lights event that draws thousands of visitors literally every, season. And it's gotten to the point where it's almost a problem. And that's just one of the things that I think we as a small city are trying to manage, trying to deal with. How do you coordinate everyone's desire to be in this charming historic city and also preserve the resources that we do have and that we, feel responsible for preserving? There's just a very huge interest by visitors to come, and then there's also a huge interest by our business owners to encourage more visitors. So we have issues with, kind of noise and sometimes inappropriate decorations in other people's minds, and just kind of almost a party atmosphere at times. So it's been a very difficult challenge to try to manage that. And I do think back at my Main Street days and think about how a well-run Main Street program has, the different committees in place to try to, manage all of those issues. It's definitely a challenge for a lot of different cities, even with Main Street programs. And there's just some over tourism media coverage that we are dealing with lately. So I will just I'm sorry. I know I kind of am going long, and I'll just say that we do take a very strong stand on historic preservation in our city. It's been a very important part of our city. We had a historic preservation master plan done in 2018 with a lot of goals. And we have 5 local historic preservation zoning districts that are under the purview of our architectural guidelines for historic preservation. We have a great board, our historic architectural review board, to, approve any changes to exterior alterations or property changes within these areas. We have an archaeological ordinance that was started in 1986, so we have a required archaeological review for soil disturbance within properties that are having construction or different changes. We have a great archaeological team, like I said, with our 3 full-time staff and lots of volunteers. We have 7 National Register historic districts. We have remaining colonial buildings and the reconstructed buildings that are all kind of designated on the National Register of Historic Places. And we deal with a lot of other issues that I won't go into today, but it's just something that you who might be potentially working for city governments or different levels of government or different associations might have to become an expert on. I never knew I would become very well versed in sea level rise and all the impacts that we are dealing with water, that started long ago, but most significantly with some recent hurricanes. Well, I will just wrap up then, and I am happy to and I apologize again. I obviously had a lot in my mind that might be of interest to everyone. But thank you, and I'll be available to answer questions.
Thanks so much. We might just have to have you back for a full presentation of your own. All of this is extremely interesting, and I know that there's a lot of experiences down at St. Augustine that I'm sure would be valuable to hear about for a lot of people. But I want to thank everybody again for joining us and all of our wonderful panelists for their extremely interesting presentations. We've got a few questions in the chat that I'm going to turn to, but if you have questions, please do put them in that chat box, and I will read those questions out to our panelists. Panelists, can you join me back on screen so I can see everybody can see you? Okay. So starting with the first question that we received from Andrea, I'm gonna ask her question and then kind of make it a 2 or 3-parter. So she asks, are any of you familiar with the Dream Builder program, which offers education to potential women entrepreneurs in Arizona? My follow-up to that if the answer is no, let me read the rest of her question. I'm so sorry. It says it was developed by Freeport McMoran and ASU's Thunderbird College. It was she said she was impressed by the concept because it seems like a good supporting component for Main Street community. So if you've heard of that, or if you've not heard of that, are there other programs that you have heard of that might be similar to that? And if so, sort of what kind of impact have you seen those programs make within your communities?
I haven't heard of it, but it sounds, I mean, Andrea, you hit the nail on the head. It sounds exactly like what we advocate for in Main Street communities, to go for it, to connect with. And Ashley, you asked exactly the right question. I just don't remember the names of these programs, but I know there's one with Ohio University in like Southeast Ohio. They have a really great program. and they've partnered kind of with folks who are focused in rural Appalachia and sort of that part of the state. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it, but they do great work. And then there is another one that I also don't remember the name of that's in West Virginia. And I want to say it's partnered West Virginia University and in one of the Main Street communities there. But the kind of university connection is a really critical one. So if you have a partner university in town, that's a great partner to start a conversation with for that kind of thing.
Thanks so much, Lindsey. Ellie or Julie, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, I will just say that I think groups like this, I hadn't heard of Dream Builder, although I Googled it and looked it up and looks very inspiring. You know, I will tell you that we did an analysis on women-owned businesses in downtown Bozeman a few years ago, and we found that about 70% of our small businesses in downtown Bozeman are managed or owned by women. And so we know they're hugely influential in our small business sector. You know, the passion, the creativity is truly there and visible. So, so we know how important, you know, women are to our small business community. So I'll just, you know, note that. We have a group called Prospera here, and they have a sector called the Women's Business Network. From what I understand, they combine an SBS or SBS support with a federal grant to support their program. So I'm not totally sure how that works, but I know they get a lot of support. They've been going on for quite a while with very little interruption. So groups like this, yes.
Thanks so much. Okay, I'll go on to our next question. It's from Gianna. She asks, do any of you have experience working with certified local governments, particularly newer designations, trying to start up a preservation program? Any advice or wins to share? And Lindsey, I saw that you answered in the chat, but Ellie and Julie, do you have any thing to say to Gianna's question?
Well, St. Augustine is a certified local government. We had that designation since the 1980s, the late 1980s. I think having a strong preservation related ordinance or set of ordinances is very important. That's kind of something that is required if you're a certified local government, but also having this strong people that help you implement that ordinance, like a strong historic architectural review board or design guidelines is very helpful. And that's, I think, a big part of why St. Augustine has kind of maintained its strong standard, its historic preservation standard, even today.
Thanks so much. Ellie, do you have any?
You know, I'll just note, and I don't know how many of our attendees today are connected to national forests or national parklands, but I do believe that our CLG within the state is also connected to our national park system. So not totally sure the details. As I mentioned, I'm not a historic preservationist, but I know that that connection is really important and something that, you know, I know our communities do support and is a big cornerstone of our CLG program.
Thanks. We've got another question from Andrea. She asks, how important is having a historic hotel to a Main Street community? And do you feel one can be created through adaptive reuse if there isn't already one there?
Well, I can chime in here because we only have one hotel that is an adaptive reuse of a building, and it's the Armory Hotel. I think it's an outstanding example of it can be done. Although I will tell you from the start to finish of the Armory Hotel, becoming a hotel, it took about 6 or 7 years. And 4 other quick pop-up hotels happened in that time period. So it's not easy, at least from our experience, but once done, extremely successful. And I would just say in general that you know, celebrating those historic hotels, I think is becoming more on trend. And that if there are historic hotels, I think there's a responsibility of a community to bring those back to life in many ways. So we also, the Baxter Hotel in downtown Bozeman has been operating not as a hotel for about 50 years now, and it's getting transformed back into a hotel. So some great examples. We'll see how long it takes, but two great examples. If you're interested in looking them up, I can share them.
Thanks. Lindsay or Julie, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I had just one. I mean, Ellie covered it perfectly, I think. I think it's one of those where it's a huge asset if you can make it happen, and you can make it happen out of all kinds of buildings. I think when you noted adaptive use, that's the key term if you don't already have a historic hotel. And luckily, with the federal and state preservation incentives, turning buildings into hotels, there are so many really good case studies from across the country with different materials. So yeah, if you have a building you have in mind, it's a great use for it. Yeah, it's a really good idea.
St. Augustine has definitely a lot of hotels. And it's interesting how the three major hotels that were kind of the draw that drew people to our city were kind of adaptively used now for different uses. But we do have a few examples of historic hotels still, like the Casa Monica went back to a hotel use, and we have one of our tallest buildings in the city is a bank tower that was built in the 1920s. And that's actually gone to our historic architectural review board and our planning and zoning board. And now going to our city commission next month for to be used now as a hotel. They're looking at a Waldorf Astoria hotel. So it's kind of interesting. It's almost like think of the white elephant buildings in your downtowns or your cities, and sometimes hotels are the perfect use for those.
Thanks. So I've got a question for you. What methods are you aware of or have you used to get young people involved in downtown preservation and revitalization?
Well, I don't mind answering. As many of you know, we have a very young population. So we also have a major university here in Bozeman. And so engaging our young people is incredibly important. They truly are the future of our community. I would say from our perspective, creating stewards. I work a lot with MSU. I'm on a strategic planning committee group right now. And I'd say that just helping our students and our young people understand the importance of our community, it's not necessarily a playground, it's their town. And so I would just use the word helping to create stewards, helping them understand why we love our community. So I think that's all I got.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Anyone else?
Yeah, no, I would echo what Ellie said, and I think a couple ways that at least we've seen some success in various communities is volunteering, of course, paid internships, if that's an option, bringing folks into that kind of office environment, what are economic incentives, those kinds of things. But also if you have access to local universities, I think, and if you're a CLG or not, if you're embarking on a historic resource survey or building out a guided tour or something like that, involving students in the research and writing, I think can really build that kind of stewardship angle that Ellie was talking about. And I think sometimes is really fun for younger people.
Thanks.
I think just a vibrant social media platform also helps draw in different age groups. I mean, our archaeology program is a great example. They post frequently, and they also draw, because of that, a lot of interested volunteer potential. So that includes people of all ages. And with our local college, the Flagler College nearby, we've are always asked for internship possibilities, which we would love to be able to, provide the internships that we are asked about. But I think it's worthwhile investing that small amount. And it kind of is a win-win for both sides.
I will just add having events and ways for students and young people to, get off campus, get out of their homes and enjoy downtown and our historic core. So, there was, I think, a period of time where there was some transition of localized events and wanting to make sure that they're still relevant to our young people. And I think we've taken that part of it very seriously to make sure that our younger people are welcomed at many times the same events that, decades-long community members are also attending. So
Thanks. So we've only got about 5 minutes left. I want to ask one more question before we log off. And I do want to say thank you to everybody who's actually participated in a discussion amongst attendees in the chat. I think it's been a lot of great information that's been exchanged. But this one comes from Joe. He asked, can you speak on the importance of preserving historic movie theaters? And he said that there's a historic movie theater in his city, which was an African American theater in Bessemer, Alabama. So,
I can start us off, take a crack at that one. No, that's a great question. And I think my answer is somewhat similar to the historic hotel answer in that those kinds of really special building typologies are really critical, like gems in a community for driving home that cultural heritage, for driving home that message about who the community was and is. And I think, something that I've seen more successful adaptive uses of historic theaters, because they can be very expensive and, depending on the size or whatever, they're not always in line with modern theater going experiences, is having an adaptable space that could show films, could show performances, could show plays, but could also be a place for playwrights and artists to gather. So having that kind of flexible interior while maintaining as much of the historic interior as possible is really critical. And I think when you enter into those different kinds of uses, you have more access to the tax credits that people were talking about, to other kinds of incentives. And I think what we're also seeing is there's a growing amount of private funders that are funding different kinds of, especially like physical projects, bricks and mortar projects like T-Mobile, like AARP. They're doing really cool stuff around placemaking that could contribute to that kind of funding package for that kind of preservation.
Ellie or Julie, do you have anything to quickly add to that?
I have to tell you, we have to re-ask that question because I was reading some of the chat questions. So
No worries.
I tried to listen to Lindsey and get the gist of it, and I was like, no, I'm out on this one.
It was about the importance of preserving historic movie theaters.
Well, Julie, you tell me. I mean, that's, I think, another part of downtown that I think we've seen a slow evolution of preserving our movie theaters and theaters. But we do have two, the Ellen and the Rialto. The Ellen would be probably considered our most historic theater downtown. It is run by a 501c3 and mostly does performance art and that sort of thing. And then across the street is the Rialto. And the Rialto went through a pretty hefty restoration about 5-6 years ago. And I will say they've struggled a little bit to find their place within the community. It's a beautiful restoration. It's a beautiful building. The inside is great, but it's small. So to bring in acts and afford itself has been a little bit tough. And so I will say that I guess size matters, I believe, from a how you use it perspective. And so as Lindsey was mentioning, kind of having that creative use or multi-use scenario, I think maybe most important when a theater is smaller and doesn't necessarily can't support itself just through ticket sales specifically. So
Yeah. Well, thank you all. We're at time, so I'm going to wrap up. And just another huge thank you to our panelists, Lindsey Wallace, Ellie Staley, and Julie Courtney. And again, also to all of you for joining us today. Like I said at the beginning, the recording of this and all of our Preserve the Past, Build for the Future webinars are posted on our ACHP YouTube channel that you can reach by also going to our website. But we'll put the link in the chat. And don't forget to register for our April and May webinars at that same link that we're going to share. And take a moment to fill out the survey if you have time. That will pop up when you exit the webinar. We use that information to improve our series each year, so it's really important when we get feedback on that. And then again, be sure to follow the ACHP on our social media and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us today, and thanks again to our panelists. Have a good day.